Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Colin Parsons. I teach in the English department and I'm the director of Global Irish Studies. And I'm very aware, as somebody who did an undergraduate degree in history and then thought over and over again whether I do a master's or a PhD in history, I'm very aware that I'm standing in front of a bunch of historians before you're about to talk about history. So I'm not going to say anything substantive at all so that I don't put my foot in it. I know what you're all like. It's terrifying. We are in the very, very happy position of launching Dr. Darragh Gannon's new book. I would say newest because there are so many books. Conflict, Diaspora and Empire, Irish Nationalism in Britain, 1912 to 1922, which was just published in, I think, July with Cambridge, we're a little bit late, with Cambridge University Press. And I will introduce Darragh and our respondents, and then I'll get out of the way, actually, and just let you know that there will be, after I introduce Darragh and the respondents, Darragh will speak for about anywhere between 10 and 45 minutes. And each of the respondents will offer thoughts on the book and the way that the book intervenes in various different fields. I'm delighted to have all of the people we have here. I will say we have apologies from Professor Linda Colley of Princeton University, who had to pull out at the very last minute. We did think about zooming her in, but it would dominate the whole conversation in the room. So, but we hope actually that she'll be able to join us again very shortly. And she has said that she would be delighted to come and talk another time. So my job is fairly simple, and I'm going to start introductions with Darragh Gannon. Many of you are here because you know him, because he was here as a visiting Fulbright scholar last year and managed to shake everybody's hand and have a drink with everybody and be extremely congenial. He is back because in April of last year, we actually appointed Darragh Associate Director of Global Irish Studies. That took a while, but he will be joining us in August as Associate Director of the program and Assistant Teaching Professor of History. We could not be more delighted. This is a much overdue appointment, and we could not have found a better candidate and a better new colleague than Darragh. So as I said, you're here probably because you know him already. You're going to get to know him a whole lot better over the next few years. Darragh will start on August 1st. And actually, what will you be teaching next year, just in case anybody needs to sign up for classes?
All right, conflict resolution in Northern Ireland and modern Ireland, 19th, 20th century. Amy will know better than I.
Yes, that's all.
That's confirmed.
Very good. All right. So, and you can see, Darragh brings to us in Georgetown a wealth of experience across 20th and 21st century Ireland, but also Ireland and its position in the world. Many of you will have actually been to a talk that he gave in May this year on the worlds of Irish Revolution and the global formation of the Irish Revolution. And so his work spans everything from that moment of revolution in the 1910s to the 1920s up to present day Northern Ireland. So we're delighted to have him teaching and teaching classes. I know they'll be popular with students in history. They'll probably be full. There'll also be students in government, conflict resolution, and others who'll be interested in taking his classes. So we are delighted that Darragh will be joining us, and we're now making him sing for his supper. But Darragh's work will also be, as I said, the Associate Director of Global Irish Studies. So hopefully you'll see a lot less of me and a lot more of Darragh over the next few years. It is personally for me, it has been a long few years running this program on my own after a death and a retirement a few years ago. And I'm just really happy that we are able to actually have a sort of a complement and to offer new classes and to bring new students into the program. It's really delightful. Darragh also writes books. He's published widely on the history of the Irish diaspora and the Irish Revolution, including Proclaiming a Republic, Ireland 1916, and the National Collection. He worked in the National Museum in Ireland for a while, but also Ireland 1922, Independence, Partition, and Civil War with our colleague Fearghal McGarry, who I'll introduce in a minute here. He is currently completing a fourth book, also to be published with Cambridge University Press, Worlds of Revolution, Ireland's Global Moment, 1919 to 1923. And it's from that book that we heard some work in May of this year. The respondents were delighted to have three very distinguished respondents. I'll read them in the order in which they're responding. So Professor Fearghal McGarry from Queen's University in Belfast. He specializes in modern Irish history and is currently writing a book on interwar anxieties about modernity. Prior to joining Queen's, he studied at University College Dublin and Trinity College Dublin, where he also lectured for a few years. His early publications include studies of Ireland and the Spanish Civil War, the Socialist Republican Frank Bryan, and the fascist Owen O'Duffy. He also explored interwar Irish radicalism in European context. And he's also written recently about the revolutionary period, including a history of the Easter Rising and a collective biography of 7 rebels associated with Abbey Theatre. And Fearghal has been running a program which you might have to remind me the exact title, the Global Irish Revolution, or
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the most recent publication was the Irish Revolution in Global History.
And that program was at Queen's University Belfast, where Darragh Gannon was involved in the program a few years ago. Our second respondent will be a neighbour of ours, Professor Laura Beers from American University. Her research focuses on modern Britain, and I take it your remarks will also focus on modern Britain. She's particularly interested in the ways in which politics influences and is shaped by cultural and social life, and in the role of mass media in modern society. Her most recent book is Red Ellen, The Life of Ellen Wilkinson, Socialist, Feminist, Internationalist, A History of Britain's Second Female Cabinet Minister. And that book was awarded the 2017 Stansky Award for Best Book in the field of modern British history. And she's currently editing the new Cambridge History of Britain, covering the period from 1900 through to the present day. Not much happened in that period. Seems like it'd be a slim volume. Our final respondent is Professor Kevin Kenny from Morris, neighbour from New York, Professor of History and Glucksman Professor in Irish Studies at New York University. He received his PhD in American History from Columbia University in 1994. His first book, Making Sense of Molly Maguire's, which is, I think, 25 years old. Is it 26 years old now? 26. It just had its birthday last year. Examines how traditions of Irish rural protest were transplanted into industrial America. And it was a sort of era-defining book, really, in Irish American history. And the latest book, The Problem of Immigration in a Slaveholding Republic, Policing Mobility in the 19th Century US, explains how slavery shaped immigration policy as it moved from the local to the national level in the period from the American Revolution through to the end of Reconstruction. So Kevin brings a wealth of experience in both diasporic Irish studies and also in 19th and early 20th century American Irish studies or American history. I'm delighted that we are gathered here with such an august panel, and my job is to hand it over to Darragh first. And then that will be followed by respondents, and then I'm going to press gang Professor Brian McCann, who's the chair of the history department here in Georgetown, to moderate or conduct or orchestrate or police a conversation. Police a conversation afterwards. You're all very, very welcome to join in the conversation. We hope that it's as robust a Q&A as we can have. So I'll hand over to Darragh. Thanks.
Thank you, Colleen, for such a generous introduction, both to the book and also in terms of my reintroduction to the Georgetown community. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the audience this afternoon, former students, current colleagues, future friends and research collaborators. When last we convened in the halcyon days of summer 2023, you'll remember, I was delivering my farewell address as Fulbright Irish Scholar just around the corner here at the Mortoris Centre for International Studies. And I'm truly delighted to have returned to Georgetown many, many months later to launch this book, but as Colleen mentioned, also to take up my role as Associate Director of Global Irish Studies and Assistant Professor of Irish History. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, never was so much owed by one scholar to so many. I am deeply appreciative to the Irish Embassy for their endorsement in this post. Thankful to friends across Washington, D.C. for making this possible. And of course, most grateful to the Georgetown Global Irish Studies Initiative and Department of History for their support. And of course, for convening today's book launch. Now, interestingly, Conflict, Diaspora and Empire was originally conceived at Maynooth University and thereafter published during my tenure at University College Dublin. So it seems entirely fitting and apropos that we were in a position to welcome representatives of both of those institutions to Georgetown this morning as part of a delegation accompanying Minister Simon Harris, who's Minister for Further and Higher Education to Georgetown. I'm grateful for your presence this afternoon as well. I'd like to echo Colleen's remarks in welcoming and thanking our distinguished scholars on the panel this afternoon, Professor Kevin Kenny from NYU, Professor Laura Beers from American University, and Professor Fearghal McGarry from Queen's University Belfast. Let me say in advance, without hesitation, that I'm immensely grateful to each of you for giving so generously of time and thought in your response to the book and in your reflections on new directions of travel in British and Irish history. And I look forward, as ever, to your comments. So some comments from me regarding the book, specifically at the moment regarding its conceptual framework. Now, any historian writing on Ireland in the period of union, I would suggest, faces a conflict of national identity, to be or not to be British history. The Acts of Union, effected from the 1st of January 1801, a united kingdom between Britain and Ireland. The State of the Union, therefore, constituted one of the overarching frameworks for understanding the Irish experience in the modern period. But where did the equation of British nation-state begin and end? Ireland, according to Linda Cully, was always difficult to accommodate within the framework of the United Kingdom in her seminal study, Britons. Irish identity, she later argued in the Journal of British Studies, was considered an ethnic other in formulations of Britishness. Modern British and Irish histories have effectively been written as separate island stories. The political prerogatives of the Northern Ireland peace process, shared past, shared future, and the proliferation of new research during the Irish Decade of Commemorations have given scholars of Irish history pause for collective thought. In 2011, Irish Historical Studies commissioned 2 review articles entitled New Directions in Irish Historiography. In the first, History and Irish Nationalism, Richard English framed the United Kingdom as integral to future interpretations of Irish political history. Quote, scholars of Irish political nationalism can evince a rather shallow understanding of how the details of British politics have related to Irish historical development. He added, one cannot understand either island without fully and properly understanding both. And Delaney's sequel article, Towards a Transnational History of Late Modern Ireland, advanced the argument for a wide-angled view of Irish nationalism to account for, in his own words, its precocious mobilization across the Irish diaspora. He stated, however, that the challenge of writing such a transnational history is that it demands knowledge of more than one national history and requires an engagement with broader conceptual issues. Conflict, Diaspora and Empire serves in some regards as a response to those injunctions to British and Irish history, and I would hope will serve as a future case study for the possibilities of researching, writing, and reflecting on British and Irish history collectively. So just a few words, I promise, on content. This study investigates Irish nationalism in Britain over the course of a historic decade, I would suggest, in United Kingdom history, between 1912 and 1922. Constitutional crisis, war, and revolution. Indeed, far from a marginal sideshow to developments in Ireland, Irish nationalism in Britain, I argue, was integral to both Irish and British contemporary assessments of the Irish Revolution. For example, successive Irish political leaders recognized mainland Britain as an important theatre of Irish political influence, from the Third Home Rule Bill to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. John Redmond and Michael Collins, in fact, directed significant and sustained campaigns of propaganda and political violence in Britain in support of their respective nationalist ambitions, Home Rule and Irish Republic. From the Ulster Crisis to the British reprisals crisis thereafter, almost every leading nationalist figure of the revolutionary period travelled across the Irish Sea to address audiences in British cities, such that they gained the nickname the Sinn Féin celebrities. Irish nationalists in Britain, furthermore, mobilised popular political interest and activism on an unprecedented scale on the ground during this period. Almost 300,000 people attended the Irish Party's Home Rule for Ireland campaign in 1913. Over 150,000 Irishmen in British centres joined the British Armed Forces over the course of the First World War, and a further 140,000 people participated in the Irish Self-Determination League propaganda campaign in England and Wales in 1920. Most significantly, perhaps, Irish nationalism was a visible and valuable presence in London outside the debating chambers of Westminster. The Sinn Féin-inspired ISDL transgressed capital spaces such as the Royal Albert Hall, Wormwood Scrubs, and Trafalgar Square, while the metropolitan threat of the IRA prompted the protection of both Whitehall and Westminster, respectively. Irish nationalist activists in Britain generated documentary interest from every major government department in Britain: Home Office, Colonial Office, War Office, Justice Office, and Cabinet Office. The influence of Irish nationalism in British centres, in fact, occupied the minds and minutes of senior British policymakers from Herbert Asquith to David Lloyd George. In its many varieties, therefore, Irish nationalism in Britain, I argue, was integral to British definitions of the Irish question. In the case of Michael Collins, who's pictured third from the right in the image behind me, in what was another important roundtable of the day, the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations, looms large, of course, in this story, because he illuminates, I suggest, many of the conflicts inherent in the Irish experience of the United Kingdom. And while Collins, the guerrilla leader, revolutionary leader, and political negotiator, is very well versed in Irish history books, perhaps less known of his Anglophile experiences in London. For example, he worked for a stockbroker's office in the city, attended West End shows, and visited the Natural History Museum during his time off. He also voraciously read the English classics. His favourite book was G.K. Chesterton's The Napoleon of Notting Hill. How apropos. And I argue or suggest in the book, I suppose, far from seeing Collins, for example, as an icon of Irish history, we should consider him as part of a joint or collective British-Irish cultural moment. In fact, the book intimates that his decision to sign the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which created the modern Irish state, was premised on his familiarity and understanding of British political cultures. Finally, a note on methodology. Identity politics, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw famously observes, takes place at a site where categories intersect. This research explores the evolution of Irish nationalism through four thematic lenses: the Irish Revolution, British politics, the Irish diaspora, and the British Empire. Read collectively at their points of intersection, I suggest, these variant lines of historical inquiry can inform new hybrid research questions, which will lead us to new directions in British and Irish history. For example, in what texts and contexts did the Irish question shape British political culture in the modern period? What narratives of the island story radicalized Irish emigrants to mobilize as an ethnic community? To what extent did the Irish in Britain imagine themselves as part of a global Irish world? And in what public spaces and private experiences were Irish communities at home with the empire? Our panel of respondents will focus their remarks on each of these themes in turn. I would just say in closing that this book is shaped not only in terms of empirical research, but also in terms of methodology by British approaches to political history, specifically the so-called new British political history, with its focus on the linguistic turn, which of course addresses questions of identity in terms of discourse analysis and so on. And I think that's a really important methodological approach which can bridge the gap between Irish and British history going forward. And so, in closing, any historian exploring Ireland in the period of union faces the conflict of national identity. The writing of Irish and British history collectively, I argue, offers necessary perspective. And so today, I offer conflict, diaspora, and empire as one such study. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. That was great, as ever. So I'd like to thank Collier, please. There you are. And the Global Irish Studies Initiative for inviting me to speak and bringing me over. And of course, I'd like to say thank Darragh for organising this roundtable. It's great to mark this really important book, and it's also great to mark Darragh's appointment here. So congratulate Darragh, but also congratulate Georgetown, such a smart appointment. So my brief is to address how Darragh engages with the theme of Irish nationalism and to reflect on the wider state of the field. And I'll begin with the latter, thinking a little bit about the state of the field at the moment. Briefly pick up on some of the themes of Darragh's work, please mention. And then I'll end by suggesting how the approach that Darragh's taken in this excellent study opens up new research agendas for other periods of Irish and global history. So having just exited the decade of centenaries, which was a big deal back in Ireland and occasionally around the rest of the world, particularly 2016, when Easter Rising has been commemorated. Having just exited that decade of centenaries, we're at a good point to take stock of recent developments in Irish historiography and in the reception of that historiography by the Irish public. And I think the decade generated a lot of valuable research, much of it drawing on newly available or digitized sources, notably the remarkable military service pensions collection, which has opened up, and I think possibly unexpectedly, a whole new field of 20th century social history based on the richness of that archive, which covers over 15,000 lives. The success of the Atlas of the Irish Revolution and the connected Irish Revolution documentary, some of you may have seen, I think Cillian Murphy was the narrator of that, demonstrated the strong public appetite for a more sophisticated retelling of a familiar story, including gender, class, non-Republican perspectives, local studies, and the diaspora, entailed a richer narrative, even if the plot, how the Irish won freedom, remained essentially much the same. Arguably, the more radical shift during the decade of centenaries was not how the history was written by historians, but how it was presented to the public. A nationalist narrative was gingerly embedded within a pluralist framing, one that embraced the varieties of Irishness articulated by past decades of revisionist scholarship, with figures like Roy Foster and David Fitzpatrick. Two major controversies occurred, centering on the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force, and on partition, but these centered on commemoration rather than historical interpretations, which were rarely disputed during the decade of centenaries. So we've come a long way from the 1990s history wars over who shot who in terms of sectarian violence in places such as West Cork. Much that was written, being rooted in a familiar narrative and chronology, didn't advance the historiography in radical ways. But for me, three areas stood out, which I just want to briefly touch on. Much interesting, often interdisciplinary scholarship explored the revolution through memory, engaging with themes such as literary remembrance, disillusionment, trauma, and family and intergenerational memory. And closely linked to this memory boom that lately took place in Irish historiography was the flourishing of gendered studies of the revolution, a theme which Darragh's book is also very much alive to. And the legacy in terms of the impact of gendered legislation and in terms of the state building that followed the revolution. And a lot of this research on gender, as with the research on memory, challenged the conventional chronological boundaries of 1913 to 1923. And the third development, which brings us to Darragh's book, was a greater use of comparative, transnational, diasporic, and global perspectives or lenses or histories. And a key question which Darragh convincingly answers throughout his study concerns the value of looking at Irish nationalism outside the Irish nation. How does a wider lens enhance our understanding of the Irish Revolution, even if our interest is more in that revolution back in Ireland? And I think Darragh brilliantly conveys the diversity, the fluidity, and the complexity of Irish nationalism in Britain. The extent to which Irish nationalism in Britain reflected British as well as Irish influences and experiences. And we see how ostensibly Irish institutions, such as the Catholic Church, exerted complex influences on the Irish in Britain, at once a powerful force for assimilating the Irish in Britain, while at the same time sustaining a sense of ethnic difference. We see how the Irish Party presented two faces in Britain. On the one hand, commemorating the Manchester martyrs or adopting the radical rhetoric of Labour. On the other hand, as Darragh puts it, making imperialism its second language in Britain. I was also struck in Darragh's book the extent to which the Irish Republicans in Britain, perhaps because of their diasporic politics, were not that successful at some of the tasks which were expected of them in terms of presenting a positive case of the Irish question to British people rather than to the Irish in Britain. That was kind of a revelation for me. So reading Darragh's book, I was reminded of another important study, Michael Wheatley's study of the Irish Midlands during the Revolution, which also was a book which made me think differently about constitutional nationalism. Wheatley's reading of the provincial press in places like Longford showed that what we think of as Revenantism looked very different on the ground, where a militant vision of popular nationalism was presented to supporters. And that gap that he shows helps to explain the crisis and collapse that followed Easter 1916. And one question I have for Darragh, which we might pick up if time allows, concerns the timing of the Irish Party's collapse in different locations, whether it's in Ireland, Britain, the US, and the Dominions. And of course, with the causes perhaps slightly different in each context. Darragh convincingly demonstrates the significance of Irish nationalists in Britain to the wider revolution. Irish nationalism in Britain is shown to be integral to Irish and British assessments of the Irish Revolution, with Britain, like America, emerging as an important theatre of Irish political influence. And I think another strength of this approach is to bring into play questions that receive less attention in locally or nationally focused studies of the Irish Revolution within Ireland. So themes such as empire, race, and colonialism, which Darragh's next book addresses on a broader canvas, spring to mind. So I just wanted to end by considering the value of diasporic and global approaches of the kind so skillfully deployed by Darragh in this book, as our attention, certainly the attention of the Irish and perhaps the diasporic public moves beyond the revolutionary era. I think a lot of people have probably heard enough about the Irish Revolution. I'm frankly bored by this stage. Darragh cites David Fitzpatrick on the devastating impact of the treaty split and civil war on diasporic opinion. Irish nationality would never again be the focus of political activity for Britain's Irish population. And I think you could that statement also holds true for the Irish in the US and in other countries such as Australia, where the Irish question had briefly dominated, particularly around 1920-21. So it seems to me that this raises a potentially awkward question. Why study Irish nationalism beyond the island when the impact of diasporic politics, whether on Ireland back home or among the emigrant community within the host country, has become more peripheral? And I think one potential answer is to broaden our focus from the politics of Irish nationalism to Irish identity more broadly. Darragh quotes Vincent Comerford's definition of Irish nationality as the contingent and ever-changing product of time and place, opportunity and construction. So there's a lot to be learned from analysing Irish nationality, Irish identity, Irishness, when that place is not Ireland. The focus of much history writing and more so public consumption of history is shifting from the struggle for independence to what was done with independence once achieved. How did an era of struggle for liberation end in a reactionary state, one in which women in particular were subordinated to a toxic vision of Irish nationhood? I would argue that that's a story that requires transnational, diasporic and comparative perspectives. Intrinsic to the Irish nation building process was the projection by church and state of representations of the virtuous Catholic nation for international and diasporic consumption. And that vision of Ireland was popular at home and abroad, but there are also many who left or felt compelled to leave, who articulated powerful critiques of the land that made them refugees, to quote Pogues in the So looking at how Irishness found expression elsewhere offers perspectives that can illuminate how Irish identity evolved there and at home. Irish trade unionists in New York and their opponents within the Catholic Church grounded their radical or reactionary visions in rival conceptions of Irishness. Global and comparative perspectives also complicate the idea of Irish developments as the product of purely Irish circumstances, such as the destabilizing legacy of the Civil War or the power of the Irish Catholic Church. Transnational studies of modernity that have largely excluded Ireland demonstrate how throughout interwar Europe, the Catholic Church's preoccupation with communism and sexual morality and the role of women was rooted in its efforts to come to terms with the modern secular state. Positioning Ireland within this wider European culture war between religious conservatives and secularists opens up new ways of thinking about dynamics that are assumed to be rooted in distinctively Irish circumstances. So whether we're analysing the conservatism of Ireland or Irish communities up to the 1960s, or how that system of thought and power and politics fell apart as Ireland liberalised thereafter, that's a story that will benefit from the sophisticated methodologies and sensitivity to multiple contexts that makes Darragh's book such a compelling read about Irish nationalism and identity in revolutionary era in Britain.
Well, that's going to be a tough act to follow. I too wanted to start off by thanking Quinn and the Global Irish Studies Initiative for having me today, and Darragh for inviting me to be part of his launch. I hope that it's not just because I was convenient. I come from American University just up the hill, but I'm a British historian by training, which shouldn't mean that I'm confessing to being not an Irish historian, but really in practice does, right? But what I am is I was in one of the practitioners. I still am. I think though in some ways my thoughts of the new political history have changed, which I've discussed. Of the new political history in my first book, Your Britain in Media and the Making of the Labour Party, on the early history of British labour at the start of the 20th century, really focuses on mediated forms of communication. So I'm going to be speaking to principally to Darragh's source base and his use of print and archival records of mostly kind of written and spoken language, and how studying that language can teach us something new about Irish nationalist identity within Britain, and also the discourses that the Irish nationalist community used in Britain to speak to a dual audience, one of the Irish diaspora, but also the British community, whom they were trying to rally in support of the cause of first Irish Home Rule and later of Irish independence. So I was thrown off this morning. I don't know if any of the rest of you sitting here have children whose school opened much later than it should have. But it threw a major monkey wrench in my day, to the extent that as I walked out the door, I thought I was just getting really strong from yoga and didn't notice the weight of my laptop in my bag. And it turned out actually my laptop was not in my bag. So I, fortunately, because of the magic of OneDrive, have my prepared notes on my phone. But if I am looking at them a bit closely, it's because I not yet given in to the reality that I might need reading glasses. So, so reading off my phone, as I said, I came to the practice of history a couple of decades ago in the moment of the new political history, which really had its heyday in the 1990s. And one of the things that I enjoyed reading this, because I know reading your introductory notes that this project was also your dissertation that you came back to. But working through the historiography, you have this moment where I can see a historiography that at a comparable time IT worked through, and there's a sort of list of names that will be familiar to anyone who works in that space: John Lawrence, Eugenio Biagini, Gareth Stedman Jones, people who are really thinking about the way that a close study of the discourses of politics could give us a new conception into how we understood things that we sort of had taken as read, that we sort of thought we knew what was happening in terms of Chartism in 19th century England, for example, or the emergence of labor in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, to take my own particular area of historical study. But if you look closely at what people were actually saying in written and spoken discourses, you might find a more nuanced story. And so this is a point of departure methodologically for Darragh that's one I'm very familiar with. It focuses on taking language seriously and looking at what was said. And so it's in that sense I'm going to speak, right? Because it's my understanding that, well, the actions of people like Michael Collins and Redmond have been well researched. Their discursive community in which they operated and to which they contributed, and the language by which they articulated and understood their social and political identities has attracted less study. And that is really what Darragh is trying to do in this book, looking at the Irish Revolution, at British politics. And that's the part that was most interesting to me, right? The way that the Irish within Britain see themselves as speaking to a British audience as well as an Irish diasporic audience. And then this broader question also of the British Empire and the place of the Irish within them. So starting with his sources, there are sites in the introduction, kind of two main parts of his source base. Charles Diamond's Catholic Herald, which you say has a combined weekly circulation in the millions. So I found that a bit hard to credit. So maybe you can substantiate for that for me. And secretly only revealed the very last pages. Only produced 34 editions. So I was, but that's one of the sources, and also the correspondence of T.P. O'Connor, who is a leader of the Irish Party in Britain. But there's also a lot of use of Redmond's speeches and articles and an archive, as well as Michael Collins, the Gaelic League, and the Irish Volunteers. So all of this gives us a rich source for looking at the language of Irish Republicans operating in Britain. And one of the main themes that comes through on this, which I thought was fascinating, is this emphasis on the two faces of home rule articulated by Redmond and the Irish Party. And the idea that one is intended for an English and Scottish, and to a lesser extent Welsh. The Welsh, get short shrift and everything, including this. So at least they're not totally written out of the narrative, right? But a British audience in Britain, and one for an Irish audience. Right, and so speaking to an Irish audience, you're appealing to ideas of community of nationality, kind of rights of national self-determination. But in appealing to an English audience to make the case for home rule, Darragh argues that the Irish Party is making a slightly different argument. And one is that the Irish, and that argument is that the Irish with home rule will be better imperial citizens. Right? That they could be, in a sense, though, it's a sort of problematic analogy, but, like the parts of the white settler colonial empire, right, that do have self-rule. Obviously, they're not, because there are ethnic differences, and this is not, places that were empty and very inverted commas that, the British have gone out and colonized that have been claiming self-rule, but white peoples who are claiming, comparable rights to exist in a world of kind of prima inter pares, but of commonwealth of nations under a monarch. But so he looks at the tensions of trying to make this kind of argument out of two sides of your mouth, which I think is very interesting, and focuses on the different ways that this argument is articulated to different communities. And you call this, citing David Monger, presentational patriotisms, which I thought was a great turn of phrase, even if borrowed. But what I thought then is really interesting about it is he makes the case that the ability to kind of spin two plates, which are often in conflict with one another, falls apart when Redmond has to make the decision of whether or not to join Lloyd George's government. David Lloyd George forms a coalition government during the First World War. He brings in the Labour Party, which also splits on this issue. Right, so Arthur Henderson joins Lloyd George's government, and Ramsay MacDonald, who is the other pillar of early 20th century Labour and is an opponent of the war, does not. He remains a pacifist throughout the conflict, but the party doesn't break in half. But the Irish can't split the difference in quite that way. They have to make a decision, and Redmond does his best, right? He tries to say, well, we're not going to legitimize Lloyd George's administration by participating in this government, but we remain supporters of the empire and we remain patriots. And that causes a schism between his attempt to maintain the support of the British for the Home Rule clause versus speaking to his own Irish diasporic audience, which does not want to participate in this Lloyd George wartime government. And he argues that at this point, Redmond loses the British, right? And that in losing the British, and Fearghal, this kind of speaks to the question that you raised about whether there's a different moment at which the Irish party stops being viable in Britain and in Ireland. So Darragh, you can definitely correct me when I'm wrong, if I'm wrong when we come to the Q&A, but my reading is that you're saying, well, they can't sort of hold the two sides together after Redmond refuses to come into the coalition because the British see this as a betrayal, that this is not supporting the imperial project of the war, whereas, and that the arguments that Redmond is making about, the Irish as British imperialists, cease to hold water for a British audience after that moment. And the other thing that really, spoke to me about this period between 1912 and 1922 is this is the period of the emergence of the Labour Party as really the principal left alternative to the Tories or the Conservatives in Britain. And this is where you start to see the eclipsing of the Liberals who, had gone into coalition in the early 20th century with the Irish Party and with whom the Irish had a working relationship by this new, more radical and explicitly working class labor movement. And so Darragh's looking at how first the Irish Party and then later Sinn Féin does or doesn't try to successfully combat the appeal of labor. And this is where I would have been interested to hear more about the identity of the Irish diaspora, not as members of the Irish diaspora, but as working men, which they principally were, right? And how did they see that conflict between identifying with an Irish nationalist project and identifying with a new movement of working class solidarity? And you definitely make the point that first the Irish Party and later Sinn Féin is conscious of the threat that Labour poses, and particularly because Labour is positioning itself as an ally of Irish nationalism, right? And saying, well, you can be part of this movement of working class solidarity and we'll also support Irish nationalism. And it has these public demonstrations in favor of Irish Home Rule. But it's also a real threat to this idea that people's first identity, or the Irish first identity should be as Irish as opposed to as working class. And so you definitely, I think, raise the way in which the Irish nationalist movement feels under threat by Labour and kind of signpost that. But I would have liked to hear kind of a bit more about the way that the Irish diaspora themselves understood that conflicted identity. And I think that speaks to the larger point that in terms of kind of future research agendas, and I don't want to pretend that I think this book should have done everything. No book could do everything, but I think that there is space for more thought about how the Irish diasporic community in Britain at this time understood themselves both as Irish, but also, very much as British. But it's not just that the Irish Party is speaking to a British audience and an Irish audience, but they're speaking to an Irish audience that is sometimes wearing their Irish hat, but is sometimes wearing their British hat, right? And in this book, we principally see the conversation with the Irish community while they wear their Irish hat. But there's less effort to think about when they're holding, each identity and when one takes primacy over the other. And I was trying to think about ways we could get at that, right? And this is what brought me to the idea of Peter Mandler, who's another name who comes up often in your text, but once used the concept of what he termed throat weight in thinking about sources, right? That there's all this political language out there, and it opens up this real space for scholars who want to do a close linguistic analysis. But you need to think about the throw weight of your sources, right? By which he meant, right, even if the Catholic Herald, which I say I'm skeptical of, had an audience of millions, right? Then for, when they consumed it, how were they consuming it? And were they consuming it alongside the Daily Mail or alongside, the Daily Herald or, other sources? It was a part of one of the many things that they took in, and maybe not how their views were being shaped. What was the impact? And similarly, we're talking about the space of the Irish Party, and I think you do a good job, a really great job, and it kind of was something that I hadn't been super aware of as a British historian, of showing how first the Irish Party and later Sinn Féin, it wasn't just kind of fundraising and getting arms and, but there was also just, this sense of public demonstrations and discussion, and the way that Irish nationalists had a very kind of public identity within Britain in this period. But also thinking about the ways that those identities were part of a more hybrid identity, particularly for Irish Britons in Britain. And so how we kind of tease that out, like what was the throw weight of these discourses that we're looking at in this book, and how did people wear their multiple identities at different times and when they took primacy. So that's just throwing out some topics to discussion, coming at it from a British perspective. And I said, I just really enjoyed it. I just learned a lot too. So it was a great read. Thank you.
Okay, let me begin by thanking Colleen Parsons and Darragh Gannon for inviting me to speak at this celebration of conflict, diaspora, and empire. My brief today, to borrow Fearghal's term, is to discuss the book in the context of one of the key words in the title, diaspora. Or diaspora, and phonetic diaspora for local flavor. Now that term, diaspora, has multiple meanings, some of them contradictory. So to be good, I think, at the outset, if we consider some of those meanings, certainly diaspora cannot be pinned down under a single definition. But neither, I think, does it carry much explanatory value if its meaning is left open-ended. So it's really up to the author to determine what they mean by that term. For centuries, indeed millennia, as we know, diaspora with a capital D referred to the dispersion and exile of the Jewish people. In the course of the 20th century, the term came to be applied to other groups, including Armenians, people of African descent, and distinctively in a West European setting, the Irish. The semantic span expanded considerably after World War II for reasons to do with decolonization, communications, and technology, as well as the history of migration. And then starting in the 1980s, the term began to proliferate to an extraordinary extent in both academic and popular usage to cover migration and displacement of virtually every kind. With that proliferation, inevitably came a decline in coherence. The sociologist Roger Brubaker nicely captured the problem in an article called The Diaspora, published in 2005, in which he demonstrated how by then the concept had acquired so many meanings that it was in danger of signifying nothing in particular. So in most contemporary usage, to the extent that diaspora carries a particular meaning, it refers either to a process, relocation and migration, or to a thing that results from that process, a migrant group or an ethnic group. So that's standard usage. It's either the process of movement or it's the result, which is a measurable social entity. The Oxford English Dictionary combines both meanings in its definition of diaspora, referring, quote, to the dispersion of Jews among the Gentile nations, all those Jews who lived outside the biblical land of Israel. And in its secondary definition, the dictionary refers, quote, to the situation of any body of people living outside their traditional homeland, illustrating that usage with a quote, the famine, the diaspora, and the long hatred of Irish Americans for Britain. So you see again both process and thing. In my own work, I gradually come to see diaspora neither as a process nor as a social entity, as the dictionary definition suggests, but instead as an idea. So instead of seeking a definitive answer to a timeless question, what is a diaspora, I examine historical evidence to determine how and why people use that idea in specific times and places. And I find that many different kinds of people, migrants themselves, but also scholars, journalists, politicians, and policymakers, deploy the idea of diaspora to interpret the world that migration creates. So approached as an idea, diaspora has three overlapping elements. It makes claims about relocation, connectivity, and return. Relocation, connectivity, and return. The first element, relocation, refers strictly to the process of departure, regardless of the subsequent history. It's referring to the process of departure. The Irish immigrants in the famine era had an understandable and well-documented tendency to see their departure as a form of involuntary exile. And this politically charged interpretation of immigration colored the massive waves of departure that followed right up through the period that Darragh covers in his book. The second element, connectivity, stands independent of the first. In other words, regardless of the form of migration, involuntary or otherwise, immigrants and their descendants can and do form diasporic connections abroad. So it's pretty commonplace for the members of a given migrant community to be involved in some way in the affairs of home. That's standard, that's commonplace in migration history. A less common, but to me more interesting form of connectivity involves communication, not only between one overseas location and a homeland, but communication within a web of globally scattered communities. In other words, connected in a multipolar rather than the unilinear form. The model there is nodes in a network rather than spokes on a wheel. And in that model, Irish nationalists in, say, 19th century New York, London, Toronto, and Sydney engaged in self-consciously transnational conversation about the liberation of Ireland and the creation of an Irish nation. People in Dublin may have been involved too. Ireland is de-centered in that model. The third element of diaspora is return. So every conception of diaspora features a homeland, whether real or imagined. Return can be literal, as in the Zionist movement. More often, it is metaphorical or spiritual, but no less potent for that. Now, Irish Americans at the turn of the 20th century had some of the lowest rates of return among migrant groups, comparable to Jewish Americans. And yet, the very absence of large-scale return sustained the powerful sense of exile at the heart of Irish American self-definition. And so, against that background, how do we conceive of diaspora, diasporic return in a context that featured constant back and forth movement between contiguous islands? as in the case of Ireland and Britain. And this question leads me to a final distinction, which is that writing Irish global history involves two complementary but analytically different approaches. The first is a diasporic approach that seeks to transcend the nation state as the primary unit of historical analysis and focuses on movement, fluidity, hybridity, searching for reciprocal interactions and sensibilities among globally scattered communities of common origin. But a comparative approach, by contrast, examines specific similarities and more often differences in the experience of similar migrants who have settled in different national settings. So the first of those approaches we might call transnational or diasporic. The second we might call comparative or cross-national. In my own work, I find that a combination of the two is essential for doing global history. So let me now sketch out how that dual approach, diasporic and comparative, because both terms have come up, applies to our current understanding of global Irish nationalism. And I will do that in order to identify what I see as the most important contributions of Darragh's book. So, very broadly speaking, the major types of Irish nationalism were active in Britain, North America, and Australia, as well as Ireland. Constitutional nationalists, in the most straightforward sense, favoured peaceful, gradual change within the existing framework of the United Kingdom. Physical force nationalists demanded a republic and were prepared to use violence if necessary. And a small group of radicals, as distinct perhaps from extremists, agitated for a revolution that would move beyond national independence to embrace questions of social justice. Now, actual practice was much messier than that template would suggest. A lot of spinning plates in Laura's terms. But I think that that tripartite framework will serve for my purposes here. So if we were to approach the question of nationalism under the transnational or diasporic heading, we'd be looking at things like the transportation of Irish political prisoners to Australia and their escape from there to the United States. We'd be looking at the many links between Republican revolutionaries in New York, London, and Dublin. We'd be looking at the writings of globally scattered nationalist leaders, journalists, and novelists. We'd be looking at visits by Irish nationalist leaders, say, to the United States. But there's plenty of room for comparative analysis as well. Within individual countries, support for different kinds of Irish nationalism can be related, for example, to class, to gender, to recency of arrival. And cross-national comparative work, focusing on different constitutional and political conditions in the countries of settlement, helps explain variations in support for different kinds of nationalism in different places around the world. Again, broadly speaking, the historiographical consensus would be that strong imperial connections in Australia, New Zealand, and for the most part, Canada, encouraged support for moderate constitutional nationalism, with the hardline Republican anti-imperial variety finding a natural home in the United States. And just to digress into one point that Fearghal raised about why study Irish nationalism abroad then or now, the most intriguing, controversial, but still compelling answer to that was given by Tom Brown in the 1960s. And that is that Irish American nationalism was directed primarily at American ends, not at Irish ends, at American ends. So involvement in nationalist movements was a way of positioning oneself socially and politically abroad. Okay, so there's the consensus that I've given you with variation across space. I think that picture is fair enough for the Dominions. I think it's fair enough even for the United States. Sustaining a strong imperial connection from afar had a certain logic if you were in Australia or Canada. And it's always been easier to preach bombs and dynamite in London if you live in Boston or New York than if you live in London or Dublin, right? So there's a certain logic there. The problem with that existing interpretation is that it tends to ignore the extent of Irish nationalism in Britain, especially in its hardline varieties, which to me, Darragh's work so comprehensively identifies and analyzes. The single most surprising and important finding in Darragh's book for me is the massive involvement by Irish men and women based in Britain in the hardline tradition. Now, it may have been unsuccessful, as Fearghal suggested, but this is what struck me most from the book. Now, my surprise here, admittedly, stems in part from my relative ignorance of British history. But ignorance is my best friend, as I know. It really is. That's why I write history, because I don't understand things. And then I try and explain them too much to my reader. I hope that they didn't understand it. But essentially, ignorance is my friend in that respect. So, born of ignorance, perhaps to some extent, but born also of familiarity with the story of the Irish on this side of the Atlantic in the United States, which is my field. Familiarity can lead to complacency. As Americanists, we find it all too easy to read the acknowledgement in the Proclamation of an Irish Republic in 1916, quote, supported by her exiled children in America, and let the matter rest at that. Joe Lee's aphorism, no America, no New York, no Easter Rising, quoted in Darragh's book, may well be valid, even if it rests on a counterfactual question that, like all such questions, is better posed than addressed. But even if we grant that Irish activists and their supporters in the United States, and perhaps especially in New York City, played a vital role in the success of hardline Irish nationalism, which is a historical fact, that actually tells us nothing about the role of the Irish in Britain, let alone their relative importance. And to understand that role, we need to turn to Darragh Gannon's book. To me, it's the scale, the sophistication, and the openness of militant activism that stands out. Okay, so in conclusion, how does conflict, diaspora, and empire, Darragh's book, fit into and change our existing understanding? And then in keeping with my brief, to what extent and in what sense is the category of diaspora central to the argument? So I would say that any deployment of diaspora in this case needs to take three distinctive characteristics into account: the contiguity of the two islands, the continuous back and forth movement by migrants and political leaders, and of course the shared constitutional and political structure created by the Act of Union. And clearly there are good ways to tell this story that have no need for the category of diaspora. You can tell that story without that category. English historians may once have neglected the Irish dimension of British history. They may continue to do so. Ireland may still be an uneasy curricular fit. But the new British history of the early modern period is no longer new, it's well established. And for the long 19th century, David Cannadine begins and ends his history of the United Kingdom with Ireland, starting with the Act of Union, including the crises over Home Rule. So what then does Darragh's deployment of diaspora add to the analysis? Well, firstly, I just point to three things that I think it adds. First, if we think of the diaspora in the most straightforward terms as a series of globally scattered communities of Irish origin or descent, Darragh's work reveals not only the connections between these communities, but more importantly for me, the differences between them, dictated by the distinct national settings in which they took root. To take one example that Laura emphasized, the Labour Party. there's no counterpart in the United States. The Irish immigrants are involved in Labour politics, but there's no counterpart to the emergence of a Labour Party as the second or co-equal, if you like, party in politics, right? So it does a huge difference. Second, Darragh shows that many of his protagonists self-consciously took part in an international conversation on Irish autonomy or independence, engaging in a brand of globally articulated activism that is usually referred to justly as diasporic nationalism. So this is an example of diasporic nationalism. Thirdly, Darragh challenges the received orthodoxy on this global Irish nationalism that I sketched out in my remarks, namely that moderate constitutional nationalism found its natural home in the Dominions, whereas the United States was the center of the hardline physical force tradition. But the first half of that proposition, I think, remains true. The Dominions did, I'm not saying there wasn't Fenianism in the Dominions, I am saying the constitutional nationalism was uppermost. The second half of the proposition requires extensive revision in light of Darragh's work. Having read Darragh's book, in other words, I find that I can no longer teach or write about Irish global history the way I once did. And that, I think, is high praise.
Thank you so much to Fearghal, Laura, and Kevin for those illuminating comments. Darragh, we will give you a very brief moment here to respond to these comments before we open up the floor.
Sure, thank you so much, Brian. Again, thank you to all of the contributors for their rich and detailed engagement with the book, and they've brought me in many different directions in my notes. Some brief kind of comments. Laura's question regarding Charles Diamond's 1.5 million in the era of fake news. I feel I should address this. I was actually from a Home Office file, and in the strict Irish historical studies tradition, I always trust my sources. But I take
maybe it speaks more to the anxieties of the Home Office.
Sure. Absolutely. No, but I take on board the reservation regarding that. And then more broadly, I mean, Fearghal, for example, asked the question, when can we date the demise of Home Rule, specifically the Redmondized version of Home Rule? And I think in the book, I kind of established the historiographical difference on that issue, that, for example, in some cases, and it seems very timely to say this, there are some people who believe that Redmondism lived on in the form of John Bruton, who only recently passed away last week, and that form of Redmondism existed right up until the late 20th, early 21st centuries. And in the book, I kind of establish, I think, that the Redmondism that I'm talking about, the two faces of Home Rule, which was both British and Irish facing, essentially was eclipsed in 1915, the decision not to take up that cabinet position, and that really was the demise of what the Home Rule project was supposed to be about, which was kind of sympathetic to imperialism and the imperial project, and ultimately could never be the same given the pressures of the imperial war effort to, and of course, the elephant in the room is that Edward Carson, the leader of the Unionist Party, takes up a position, I think, as Attorney General in Lloyd George's coalition government, whereas Redmond does not. And that's kind of where I would take that. And again, Kevin's very generous and wide-ranging assessment. And as you were speaking, I was conscious that you mentioned the likes of New York and Toronto, and some of my other work, most notably in Fearghal's edited volume, I kind of moved in that direction of kind of, and your article in the Journal of American History, of course, was seminal, this idea of kind of diasporic, but also comparative approaches. And that's something I'll definitely look into going forward as kind of my paradigm. But I'm really struck by your point about, going back to Roy Foster's term, varieties of Irishness, and how in different parts of the world, expression of Irish nationalism, representations of Irish nationalism, and ultimately the performance of Irish nationalism differed. And I think that's a really important point to make for any scholars in the room who are looking at Irish nationalism in different geographical spaces. How do we kind of frame that version? I take your point that the British expression in your own words of the Republican hardline tradition perhaps challenges the orthodoxy that America had the copyright, if you'll use the expression of physical force nationalism. Again, thank you all for your very generous comments, and I'm looking forward to questions from the floor.
Do you see a future or precedent for maybe a more inclusive definition of Irish citizenship, particularly looking towards the diaspora that may continue to see some form of national home?
Very interesting. And having to open that to the floor as well, to the group rather as well. It's an interesting question. If you look at any of the recent, are you talking about contemporarily? The Global Ireland Initiative, which is the Department of Foreign Affairs kind of project to, I guess, promote Ireland internationally, uses, for example, the term affinity diaspora, which is people who feel some sense of belonging culturally, especially to ideas of Irishness, but are not necessarily of Irish birth or extraction. And so that terminology is certainly in the ether. And it will be interesting going forward. Perhaps today is not the right forum, but I know that there are colleagues in Washington, D.C. who want to see, for example, the issue of an Irish vote extended to the Irish diaspora. And there's a really important article in the Irish Echo from last year, when some of our friends made the point that the contribution of Irish nationalists 100 years ago to the making of the Irish state has not adequately been reflected in the constitutional their constitutional contribution or position in the Irish state. So I think that's an open question, but it's really important that these histories are written to establish, at least historiographically, the role of Irish immigrants in making the modern Ireland, whether it's in the form of the Irish state or a broader global island story.
I think one consideration is there's quite a lot of us, because it depends, it's when you say there are 35 million Irish Americans, that's an elective. If people choose to identify that as their primary ethnicity, it's gone down. It was higher from that once, and then it went down, and now it's coming back up. So it's a rough and ready figure, and then you come up with a figure of 70 million globally, which is even rougher and readier. The maximum population of the island is 8.5 million. 10 million people left between 1700 and 2000, right? So the numbers militate against say giving the vote to every member of the diaspora. But there are proposals for having the vote, say, in the Senate, possibly in the future the vote some say in presidential elections. All of these things are under discussion. The Irish government has a extremely well orchestrated diaspora strategy in line with several other national governments, and whether Mexico, China, India. So the conversation is certainly underway. The numbers are very distinctive of the Irish case.
But isn't there also, I mean, this is just anecdotal from my colleagues within British history who are British in Britain, many of whom have Irish family, and all of a sudden see the access to Irishness as a portal to Europe, which has kind of changed the ways that the British diaspora, the Irish diaspora within Britain thinks about their identities, because of what transactionally they can get from owning that Irish identity, even if they don't want to own it in other aspects of their life, happily living in Britain. But I mean, I have a very good friend who just proudly got his Irish passport. He's never lived anywhere but Oxford. You know what I mean? Never intends to.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought that it's a really interesting question in terms of the big thing of what we're talking about today, which is that you can't really, I think, properly think about Irish identity in Ireland and Irish identity elsewhere without thinking about how those two things interconnect and interrelate, and how when one or the other changes, how they both change. And one of the things which I'm kind of working on now is how, after this moment of revolution, which is really successful kind of mobilizing of the diaspora, the Irish state uses, it sort of defines its national identity by much more narrowly dividing it and identifying just between Catholicism and national and so on. But an important part of that is like how they project that image abroad for international validation. So things like the Eucharistic Congress in 1932 or whatever, but also just the kind of when Irish politicians go over to America and the kind of the narrative that they have about Ireland. And I think one of the really interesting things about Ireland is how history is a part of how you tell that story about Ireland. And so what the government has done, I think, quite effectively, shrewdly in the decade of centenaries is kind of, in a sense, going, I think we are proud of Ireland becoming an independent nation, revolutionary, but we have 20 different ways of telling that story that's more kind of inclusive. And part of that is because Ireland itself is now, has significant immigration, and it's a different kind of country, as well as, a desire to escape that old narrative about Irish identity being rooted in the particularly kind of narrow sort of sense of. So I think there's a really interesting question about how that then projects back to, to what the significance of that then is for Irish communities around the world. And one of the interesting things I did in 2016 was went to lots of different places where there was an Irish community to give talks. And in some places, people are really receptive to a kind of a more modern sense of Irish identity and how that was featuring in this. But we went to other places where there were people who were older people, most people were sort of disappointed about not hearing about Patrick Pearse and dying for the faith and so on. And really brought home to me that like people have different senses of what the Irish story is in different places, and everywhere those stories are always kind of changing. They're never kind of static.
I guess that was Boston.
It could be. It was actually Melbourne.
Yeah. See, this question for Darragh actually may be more relevant to the book you're writing now than the one we're talking about, although it is relevant to that. I was just thinking about this in the context of other nationalisms, right? And the way in which you have, in this same period, all sorts of Indians who are in Britain and who are associating with one another and sort of inspiring one another as nationalists. It's in 1900, you have the first Pan-African conference in London. And so there are ways in which this is, as I guess you're probably going to say, a story that transcends the Irish experience, but the Irish experience is at the same time very distinctive because there are so goddamn many Irishmen in Britain, unlike Africans, Indians, and the like. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on both the similarities and the differences.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and the comment. I mean, I totally agree with you. Like London is a perfect example, of course, post First World War, it's the height of empire, and so you see representations from Egyptians, Indians, and Burmese, as they were then, all coming into this kind of, an anti-imperial metropolis that they would have viewed it. And it really struck, and you're quite correct, it's kind of in the next book, I like to say, forthcoming. But so kind of, you can frame those kind of cities as kind of cosmopolitan thought zones. So at one level, the book I've just written or completed is about the idea of Irish identity as it relates to kind of the metropole and the Irish diaspora community. But again, you can take a different angle. And it goes back to Endevini's argument of a wide-angle view of this subject. And again, I think this idea of cosmopolitan thought zones really resonates. And, Michael Goebel, for example, has used Paris as an exemplar in this period as kind of, the seeds of anti-colonial nationalism in Southeast Asia, for example. So I think that's definitely a paradigm one can use. And I think cities are very, very important in that regard. The idea of global cities. And New York would be another example of that. If I'm not mistaken, isn't David Brundage writing a book on that subject?
He is, yeah, on those connections. It's, Indian, Caribbean, some Pan-African, Irish actors. I would, if I could, to link your question to something that Laura had said, and I had mentioned.
If you're anticipating the question I was having,
perhaps you want to give it a try.
No, you go first. I'll tell you.
It's a bit of a jump, but I was struck in Laura's critique of the. So, who are the Irish in Britain? right? And we're seeing them under the heading of being Irish, but clearly many of them were British. And the answer to that question is going to vary a lot, right? If you're looking at Michael Collins, if you're looking at one of the other 1916 leaders who spent a little bit of time there, or if you're looking at a cosmopolitan intellectual, or if you're looking at one of the tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of Irish who settled there and somehow became Irish British, in terms we find hard to articulate compared to Irish American. So it depends on who you're looking at. But in terms of that question, thinking of them under both headings or under more than one heading, but link that to what I threw out in my own remarks about what I call the Brown thesis, Tom Brown's thesis. So this is Tom Brown's provocative idea in the 1960s that if we want to understand Irish American nationalism, we need to understand that it was directed towards American ends. Irish ends certainly, but primarily towards American ends. It was a way of getting ahead in America. There's merit to that thesis, but there are limitations to the thesis. And people who've critiqued the thesis have said, okay, that works if you're a home ruler, if you're supporting constitutional nationalism, if you're upwardly mobile and aspiring to be middle class. That's a pretty convincing model. What if you were a labor radical, or what if you were subscribing single-mindedly to what I called the physical force hardline tradition? That would be a peculiar way of getting ahead in America, right? Seriously, by supporting bombs or dynamite. But that's where I see. So where I picked up on the prevalence of the hardline tradition in Britain to an extent that surprised me. And again, maybe I don't have enough knowledge, but it did surprise me, and it convinced me. But how does that then get to Laura's question about who are the Irish in Britain, if that's the tactics and strategy that they're adopting? You see them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point in terms of, again, we're talking about a community in the millions in this period, and the book focuses on a kind of, I guess, a group that are documented, very often self-documenting their histories. And that's another point, that some of the sources which are, Fearghal will be familiar with this territory, are kind of retrospective memoirs in which they are writing themselves into the history books. But you do have that quote at the end of the book, the last quote, in which T.T. O'Connor, who was mentioned earlier, is kind of the lost leader of the Irish in Britain this time, and kind of writes to Dublin in 1922, arguing for a continuation of public politics, saying we must, protect the interests of young Irish people in Britain in terms of Catholic education, in terms of upward social mobility, but that story kind of gets lost, ultimately. So there is a sense that there's the closed chapter of Irish history, in terms of a moment where you could be both Irish and British. And I think it's the establishment of the Irish state makes people decide, sometimes in terms of their residence, which they are.
I guess on that, to come back to Dane's comparative question, I wanted to kind of push you on the limits of that comparison, because one of the things that comes through in Redmond's imperial rhetoric, right, where he talks about the Irish as having built the empire, sort of like Linda Colley Scott's almost, I sort of felt that comparison, right, as, active architects of empire, but also of this possibility of an Ireland under home rule being like Australia or Canada, and a kind of, loyal heart of a commonwealth of nations, in ways that are not unproblematic given the history of Ireland, but are less problematic because of racial narratives than when you get Indian home rule being discussed, and certainly when you get these, Pan-African Congress and these diaspora narratives. And how is Ireland both like and unlike these other diaspora communities that are talking about home rule and talking about independence in London at this point.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and just very briefly, because if you want to come into this further, you've worked on this as well. I mean, if you look at Paris rather than London, more or less in the same period, you do have kind of almost the two faces of republicanism there. You've got Irish nationalists saying, on one level, we're the only white race who have not been given self-determination by Woodrow Wilson and so on. And yet at the same time, they're engaging what Michael Goebbels terms kind of shadow diplomacy outside of Versailles, because they never get in, of course. With, you know, the likes of Saad Zegloul, the leader of Egyptian nationalism, and a young Ho Chi Minh is mixing with these, you know, with Irish. So they're playing both sides again in different spaces. And I think, just very briefly, I think it would be interesting. We're never allowed to play the counterfactual game as historians in writing. So these four are the only opportunities we get. But if Redmond had not died, and home rule had lived, shall we say, you know, would there have been a more Dominion-centric Ireland, you know, only a couple of years later? Because his view and his vision of Ireland in the world was very much as part of empire, you know. So I'm afraid you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, Darragh and I worked together on the project with other people for 3 years, looking at sort of the global dimensions of the Irish Revolution. And, you know, one of the things which came in much stronger than we thought it would be kind of different views on race and how it's used in different ways, as Darragh said, and also the connections between different anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, different kind of nationalist groups. It really, it's really much more important outside Ireland than it is within Ireland, you know, in that sense. But I think one thing that's important here is, like, I think one of the reasons why the Irish Republicans are quite successful in 1919 to 21 is because when the revolution happens, because the 1919 is the year when how people think that political parties, you know, fundamentally begins to change with the Wilsonian kind of ideal, the idea that, you know, power should only operate with the consent of the governed, and that throws up this huge kind of you know, existential dilemma for how imperialists rationalize the party they have and the party they do not wish to kind of give up. And I think in some ways the Irish have won the lottery here of diasporas, because they have a huge diaspora, because they're the first really to have a big modern diaspora, and most of them, or many of them, have ended up in the most politically and economically powerful country in the world. And they have a direct access into the Democratic Party and so on. And that's why I think the methods which Irish Republicans use, particularly in America, become so influential. But also, I think there's a danger that you could slip into a kind of a left wing, a woke version of how the Irish saved civilization. You know, it's like, you know, yes, we invented anti-colonials. You know. But I think one of the things that by looking at comparing Irish Republicans with other groups, such as the group I looked at Koreans, is how they use the same kind of tactics, because everybody's using these tactics. You go to Paris, you propagandize, you quote Wilson, you raise money, you have national kind of float, you know, loan funds, you elect a provisional government, you have a president, you send him to America, he goes to all the cities where your supporters are. And of course, the Irish aren't really inventing this, they're just doing it much better than the other groups at that time, because there's more of them, and they're kind of lucky in that sense. So I think we have to think, as well as we have to think of the idea of contemporaneity, that, you know, that these different political things are becoming possible at a particular moment everywhere, you know.
So I keep taking your question on anti-colonialism and turning it into my question. So but if you don't mind, I'll ask Darragh a quick question based on it. So, I mean, the book is set in a pretty unusual period. There's a revolution, after all. Ireland breaks from the empire. So if we think more generally about the position of people of Irish origin and descent in Britain and then in America, I mean, I'm thinking very practical terms of when I lived in London in the 1980s, how incredibly uncomfortable it was to be Irish at certain moments. But when a bomb went off in Canary Wharf, that's what I'm talking about. It does seem to me that although the historiographical consensus I mapped out would place the United States as a major center of one tradition, and your book brings out that tradition in Britain, overall, support for moderation is going to be more common than support for extremism in both places.
Yes.
Maybe not between 1916 and 1920, right? But overall, if we look at the position of Irish people of Irish origin and descent in either country, it almost stands to reason that the default would be to support the more modern cause.
So I think that's a very, very important, point. And again, you can look back in terms of the long 19th century, kind of the dynamite campaign, and if you look at the Irish community who were resident in Britain, were very often targeted because of, they were perceived as being kind of the fifth column in British society in that regard. And it's interesting as well in some of the early reviews of the book, that comparisons were made with the later Troubles in the context of that physical force tradition. And so, there are some scholars who see kind of this issue of physical force nationalism in kind of a short 20th century context, right? That there's a kind of a lineage there and so on and so forth. And to a certain extent, the idea of propaganda of the deed, that what takes place in London has a more strategic value than what actually happens in Belfast or Dublin. But I do absolutely take on board the idea that, to recognize the impact on communities who are resident in Britain. And you see that in 1920 when the IRA attacked the Liverpool docks. An ill-fated move in many respects, because Collins is using that to transport weapons across the Irish Sea. So, but the impact falls then socioeconomically on the Irish community in Liverpool, who not only depend on the docklands for their own work and so on, but again are targeted by the local, British community as kind of as being part of this of this conspiracy. And I think it goes back, Kevin, to this idea of when does one identify as ethnically Irish, the temporal nature of being Irish abroad. There's a contingency there that we need to acknowledge as well.
This is a nice example actually of what things are talking about, particularly in terms of talking about different kind of diasporas, because they sort of come into conflict with the dynamite campaign, the 1870s Britain, and Niall Whelan's done some fantastic research on this. So there's people who are blowing up it's in some ways it's like the first modern terrorist campaign, blowing up London Underground, House of Commons, kind of things. But where are these diaspora coming from? It's not the Irish in Britain. They're Irish who immigrate to America and then come, like Top York, and they come over to Britain, and they're not really welcome among the Irish community in Britain, because they're the ones who are getting. So it's a really, it just shows how complex with long distance nationalism plus travel plus opportunities. And it's also, I think the other thing, if you look at long Irish nationalism over that long period, it's really only in very rare circumstances where there's genuine mass support for violent means, or at least violent means alongside other kind of means. And it's really just in moments of crisis where it seems that clearly there's some kind of oppression, some kind of political failure for ordinary politics to function.
I think we have time for one last question.
Well, mine's going to be on a more lighter note. That's okay.
Probably good to end up.
First, Laura, I always tell everybody it's the size of the font. It's not our eyes. Okay. So I go to I'm Irish and Italian, so conflicted in the head, and the last name is Condon, so that's always been taken the wrong way. Okay, and I always have to say no, it's an N, not an M. Well, when I went to Ireland in the early '90s or whatever, as soon as I got off the bus, I ran to a pub because I wanted a cold beer, and there's a older gentleman who's now my age now at the time, had one too many pints, and he insisted that I should know the Kennedys from Massachusetts. I have to know the Kennedys. I said, no, I don't know them. But he insisted I should know the Kennedys from Massachusetts.
All beautiful countries is local, right?
On that note, let her know. Thank you so much and congratulations to Darragh.
Thank you.